Okay. Now let's share the link because I forgot to. Wonderful. Just wonderful. Shit. Where did I put the link? In my profile somewhere. Somewhere. Part 1. Part 2. Part 3. Nearly done. Nearly done. Just got to put the link on the Twitter thread to this. It's not even raining. I don't know why it keeps going out. There we go. Okay. Yes. YouTube cannot defeat me. It can only but that might be enough. Brave YouTube. Okay, we left off at affectation. So, his affectation of civic interest did not diminish, and he lost no opportunities for helping such leaders as Stephen Hopkins, Joseph Brown, and Benjamin West in their efforts to raise the cultural tone of the town, which was then very much below the level of Newport in its patronage of the liberal arts. He had helped David Jenks found his bookshop in 1763, and was thereafter his best customer, extending aid likewise to the struggling Gazette that appeared each Wednesday at the sign of Shakespeare's Head. In politics, he ardently supported Governor Hopkins against the Ward Party, whose prime strength was in Newport, and his really eloquent speech at Hackers Hall in 1765 against the setting off of North Providence as a separate town with a pro-Ward vote in the General Assembly did more than any other one thing to wear down the prejudice against him. But Ezra Whedon, who watched him closely, sneered cynically at all this outward activity and freely swore it was no more than a mask for some nameless traffic with the blackest gulfs of Tartarus. The revengeful youth began a systematic study of the man and his doings whenever he was in port, spending hours at night by the wharves with a dory in readiness when he saw lights in the Kerwin warehouses, and following the small boat which would sometimes steal quietly off and down the bay. He also kept as close a watch as possible on the Pawtuxet farm, and was once severely bitten by the dogs the old housekeeping couple loosed upon him. End of chapter 2. Thank you for cutting me off 3 minutes before I would have finished that bit. Chapter 3. In 1766 came the final change in Joseph Kerwin. It was very sudden and gained wide notice among the curious townsfolk, for the air of suspense and expectancy dropped like an old cloak, giving instant place to an ill-concealed exultation of perfect triumph. Kerwin seemed to have difficulty in restraining himself from public harangues on what he had found or learned or made, but apparently the need of secrecy was greater than the longing to share his rejoicing, for which no explanation was ever offered by him. It was after this transition, which appears to have come early in July, that the sinister scholar began to astonish people by his possession of information which only their long-dead ancestors would seem to be able to impart. I can't think of any information my ancestors would have had that could blackmail me in the current, like the present day. Nope. But then again, people can't be blackmailed by revelations of race mixing anymore. Well, they can in some parts of the world, but they shouldn't be. I think that's the main one. Your grandma was sleeping with the milkman by $1 million. Good on you, Granny. Oh yeah, those family secrets. I tell people. I don't care. It's not the same world. But Curwen's feverish secret activities by no means ceased with this change. On the contrary, they tended rather to increase, so that more and more of his shipping business was handled by the captains, whom he now bound to him by ties of fear as potent as those of bankruptcy had been. He altogether abandoned the slave trade, alleging that its profits were constantly decreasing. Oh, that's a good reason to stop being part of the slave trade. Every possible moment was spent at the Pawtuxet farm, though there were rumours now and then of his presence in places which, though not actually near graveyards, were yet so situated in relation to graveyards that thoughtful people wondered just how thorough the old merchant's change of habits really was. Ezra Whedon, though his periods of espionage were necessarily brief and intermittent on account of his sea voyaging, had a vindictive persistence which the bulk of the practical townsfolk and farmers lacked, and subjected Curwen's affairs to a scrutiny such as they had never had before. Ooh, he's getting spied on by a handsome seaman. Many of the odd manoeuvres of the strange merchants' vessels, which had been taken for granted on account of the unrest of the times, when every colonist seemed determined to resist the provisions of the Sugar Act, which hampered a prominent traffic. Smuggling and evasion were the rule in Narragansett Bay, and nocturnal landings of illicit cargoes were continuous commonplaces. But Whedon, night after night, following the lighters or small sloops which he saw steal off from the Curwen warehouses at the Town Street docks, soon felt assured that it was not merely His Majesty's armed ships which the sinister skulker was anxious to avoid. Prior to the change in 1766, these boats had for the most part contained enslaved people. That's not what it says in the text. Who were carried down and across the bay and landed at an obscure point on the shore just north of Pawtuxet, being afterward driven up the bluff and across country to the Curwen farm, where they were locked in that enormous stone outbuilding, which had only high, narrow slits for windows. After that change, however, the whole program was altered. Importation of enslaved people ceased at once, and for a time Curwen abandoned his midnight sailings. Then, about the spring of 1767, a new policy appeared. Once more the lighters grew wont to put out from the black, silent docks, and this time they would go down the bay some distance, perhaps as far as Namquit Point, where they would meet and receive cargo from strange ships of considerable size and widely varied appearance. Curwen's sailors would then deposit this cargo at the usual point on the shore and transport it overland to the farm, locking it in the same cryptical stone building which had formerly received the enslaved people. The cargo consisted almost wholly of boxes and cases, of which a large proportion were oblong and heavy, and disturbingly suggestive of coffins. God, what do you think they were? What could those boxes have been? It's another mystery for the ages, I'm afraid. Whedon always watched the farm with unremitting assiduity, visiting it each night for long periods, and seldom letting a week go by without a sight, except when the ground bore a footprint revealing snow. Even then, he would walk as close as he could in the travelled road or on the ice of the neighbouring river to see what tracks others might have left. Finding his own vigils interrupted by nautical duties, he hired a tavern companion named Eleazar Smith. Eleazar? I don't know how to pronounce that. To continue the survey during his absences. And between them, the two could have set in motion some extraordinary rumours. That they did not do so was only because they knew the effect of publicity would be to warn their quarry and make further progress impossible. Instead, they wished to learn something definite before taking any action. What they did learn must have been startling indeed, and Charles Ward spoke many times to his parents of his regret at Whedon's later burning of his notebooks. God, we're getting so close to actually finding out something, anything about what's been going on. All that can be told of their discoveries is what Eleazar Smith jotted down in a none too coherent diary, and what other diarists and letter writers have timidly repeated from the statements which they finally made, and according to which the farm was only the outer shell of some vast and revolting menace, of a scope and depth too profound and intangible for more than shadowy comprehension. Typical. Very Lovecraft typical. It is gathered that Whedon and Smith became early convinced that a great series of tunnels and catacombs, inhabited by a very sizable staff of persons beside the old Native American man and his wife, underlay the farm. A story can be 20 pages of someone acting suspicious. This was a suspicious man, and then he married an 18-year-old, which the whole town agreed was gross, but they couldn't stop it happening. The house was an old peaked relic of the middle 17th century, with an enormous stacked chimney and diamond-paned lattice windows, the laboratory being in a lean-to toward the north, where the roof came nearly to the ground. This building stood clear of any other, yet judging by the different voices heard at odd times within, it must have been accessible through secret passages beneath. These voices, before 1766, were mere mumblings and enslaved person whisperings and frenzied screams, coupled with curious chants or invocations. Yeah, he seems to say the town thought it was a bit gross, and their response was to not visit her as much, which seems shitty but realistic. Sorry your dad was vulnerable to blackmail, now this is your life. After that date, however, they assumed a very singular and terrible cast as they ran the gamut betwixt dronings of dull acquiescence and explosions of frantic pain or fury, rumblings of conversation and whines of entreaty, pantings of eagerness and shouts of protest. They appeared to be in different languages, all known to Curwen, whose rasping accents were frequently distinguishable in reply, reproof, or threatening. Sometimes it seemed that several persons must be in the house: Curwen, certain captives, and the guards of those captives. There were voices of a sort that neither Whedon nor Smith had ever heard before, despite their wide knowledge of foreign parts, and many that they did seem to place as belonging to this or that nationality. The nature of the conversation seemed always a kind of catechism, as if Curwen were extorting some sort of information from terrified or rebellious prisoners. Counterproductive, but not unexpected. Yeah, exactly. We've all had that friend who gets a new boyfriend, and you're like, oh, I'm pretty sure his mysterious farm laboratory in the middle of nowhere has an extensive network of tunnels beneath it. I don't want to go over there, honestly. You just kind of wait till they break up. Whedon had many verbatim reports of overheard scraps in his notebook, for English, French, and Spanish, which he knew, were frequently used, but of these nothing has survived. He did, however, say that besides a few ghoulish dialogues in which the past affairs of Providence families were concerned, most of the questions and answers he could understand were historical or scientific, occasionally pertaining to very remote places and ages. Once, for example, an alternately raging and sullen figure was questioned in French about the Black Prince's massacre at Limoges in 1370, as if there were some hidden reason which he ought to know. Curwen asked the prisoner, if prisoner it were, whether the order to slay was given because of the sign of the goat found on the altar in the ancient Roman crypt beneath the cathedral, or whether the dark man of the Haute Vienne coven had spoken the three words. Failing to obtain replies, the inquisitor had seemingly resorted to extreme means, for there was a terrific shriek followed by silence and muttering and a bumping sound. I would love to read a novel about the 100 Years' War and Lovecraftian horror. except that probably exists. Probably many of them exist, and they're probably all really terrible. None of these colloquies were ever ocularly witnessed, since the windows were always heavily draped. Once, though, during a discourse in an unknown tongue, a shadow was seen on the curtain which startled Whedon exceedingly, reminding him of one of the puppets in a show he had seen in the autumn of 1764 in Hackers Hall, when a man from Germantown, Pennsylvania, had given a clever mechanical spectacle advertised as a view of the famous city of Jerusalem, in which are represented Jerusalem, the Temple of Solomon, his royal throne, the noted towers and hills, likewise the sufferings of our Saviour from the Garden of Gethsemane to the cross on the hill of Golgotha, an artful piece of statuary, worthy to be seen by the curious. It was on this occasion that the listener, who had crept close to the window of the front room whence the speaking proceeded, gave a start which roused the old Native American pair and caused them to loose the dogs on him. After that, no more conversations were ever heard in the house, and Whedon and Smith concluded that Curwen had transferred his field of action to regions below. I know! That name is crazy wordy. Just be like, it's a puppet of a whole city, and you won't believe what locations are included. That's a title from our times, it's a clickbait title. You go in and you're like, oh, I could believe every single one of those, and you write a mean comment about it, but that's what he wanted because that's engagement and clicks. That's money to him. I'm upset about clickbait. Like, what culture? I watch their horror videos because, I don't know, it's an elaborate form of self-harm, I think. And they've started pronouncing words and names really wrong. And I think people in the comments are speculating that it's just so that people will make more comments and have more engagement. I don't know, maybe. I don't see why people shouldn't be paid per letter. Except for me. I should be paid for every letter I don't write. Regions below. That such regions in truth existed seemed amply clear from many things. Faint cries and groans unmistakably came up now and then from what appeared to be the solid earth in places far from any structure, whilst hidden in the bushes along the river bank in the rear, where the high ground sloped steeply down to the valley of the Pawtuxet, there was found an arched oaken door in a frame of heavy masonry, which was obviously an entrance to caverns within the hill. When or how these catacombs could have been constructed, Whedon was unable to say, but he frequently pointed out how easily the place might have been reached by bands of unseen workmen from the river. Joseph Curwen put his seamen to diverse uses indeed. I think I've just found the most beautiful sentence in English literature. During the heavy spring rains of 1769, the two watchers kept a sharp eye on the steep river bank to see if any subterranean secrets might be washed to light, and were rewarded by the sight of a profusion of both human and animal bones in places where deep gullies had been worn in the banks. Naturally, there might be many explanations of such things in the rear of a stock farm, and in a locality where old Native American burying grounds were common, but Whedon and Smith drew their own inferences. It was in January 1770, whilst Whedon and Smith were still debating vainly on what, if anything, to think or do about the whole bewildering business, that the incident of the Fortaleza occurred. Fortaleza? Exasperated by the burning of the revenue sloop Liberty at Newport during the previous summer, the customs fleet under Admiral Wallace had adopted an increased vigilance concerning strange vessels. And on this occasion, His Majesty's armed schooner Signet, under Captain Charles Leslie, captured after a short pursuit one early morning the Fortaleza of Barcelona, Spain, under Captain Manuel Arruda, bound according to its log from Grand Cairo, Egypt to Providence. When searched for contraband material, the ship revealed the astonishing fact that its cargo consisted exclusively of Egyptian mummies, consigned to Sailor ABC, who would come to remove his goods in a lighter just off Namquit Point, and whose identity Captain Aruda felt himself in honour bound not to reveal. The Vice Admiralty Court at Newport, at loss what to do in view of the non-contraband nature of the cargo on the one hand, and of the unlawful secrecy of the entry on the other hand, compromised on Collector Robinson's recommendation by freeing the ship but forbidding it a port in Rhode Island waters. There were later rumours of its having been seen in Boston Harbour, though it never openly entered the port of Boston. Sometimes you just get dead bodies in the mail, and sometimes that just happens. People should relax and mind their own business, honestly. This extraordinary incident did not fail of wide remark and providence, and there were not many who doubted the existence of some connection between the cargo of mummies and the sinister Joseph Curwen. His exotic studies and his curious chemical importations being common knowledge, and his fondness for graveyards being on suspicion, it did not take much imagination to link him with a freakish importation which could not conceivably have been destined for anyone else in the town. As if conscious of this natural belief, Curwen took care to speak casually on several occasions of the chemical value of the balsams found in mummies, thinking perhaps that he might make the affair seem less unnatural, yet stopping just short of admitting his participation. Whedon and Smith, of course, felt no doubt whatsoever of the significance of the thing, and indulged in the wildest theories concerning Curwen and his monstrous labours. I'm going to finish the next paragraph, which is the end of this chapter. Ground up mummy has been an ingredient in medicine for a really long time. We lost a lot of mummified remains. Medicinal mummy. It's very sad and gross, like a lot of things that happened in olden time. I'm going to make an amazing teacher. Hello, my love. Come on, sweetie. You are also very sad and gross. The following spring, like that of the year before, had heavy rains, and the watchers kept careful track of the riverbank behind the Curwen farm. Large sections were washed away, and a certain number of bones discovered, but no glimpse was afforded of any actual subterranean chambers or burrows. Something was rumoured, however, at the village of Pawtuxet, about a mile below, where the river flows and falls over a rocky terrace to join the placid landlocked cove. There, where quaint old cottages climb the hill from the rustic bridge, and fishing smacks lay anchored at their sleepy docks, a vague report went round of things which were floating down the river and flashing into sight for a minute as they went over the falls. Of course, the Pawtuxet is a long river which winds through many settled regions abounding in graveyards, and of course the spring rains had been very heavy. But the fisher folk about the bridge did not like the wild way that one of the things stared as it shot down to the still water below, or the way that another half cried out, although its condition had greatly departed from that of objects which normally cry out. Now it's getting good. That rumour sent Smith, for Whedon was just then at sea, in haste to the river bank behind the farm, where surely enough there remained the evidences of an extensive cave-in. There was, however, no trace of a passage into the steep bank, for the miniature avalanche had left behind a solid wall of mixed earth and shrubbery from aloft. Smith went to the extent of some experimental digging, but was deterred by lack of success, or perhaps by fear of possible success. It is interesting to speculate on what the persistent and revengeful Whedon would have done had he been ashore at the time. So we've covered a lot of Joseph Curwen. And yeah, we've there's been a lot of backstory, and it's been very dry, and basically the guys that, everyone thinks he's a sorcerer or whatever. And we had to wait a really long time for the wild way one of the things stared as it shot down to the still water below, or the way that another half cried out, although its condition had greatly departed from that which objects which normally cry out. Those lines are good. Those lines are very good, but we had to wait too long for them. That's my review so far. So we are up to chapter 4 of part 2. There's ages left. It's a novella, basically. So, what I will do, instead of finishing, reading another chapter of Joseph Kerwin's, frankly kind of boring backstory, is I'm going to read you a funny story by Lovecraft. It's not really funny, but it's meant to be. Lovecraft. A Reminiscence of Dr. Samuel Johnson. It is a short story. Where is it? Okay, so Lovecraft wrote an entire short story about a 200-year-old man who was writing down in a 200-year-old fashion how he remembers Dr. Johnson, Samuel Johnson, who wrote the first English dictionary and nearly killed Blackadder that one time. So this was Lovecraft making fun of himself and his kind of affectations and that. The privilege of reminiscence, however rambling or tiresome, is one generally allowed to the very aged. Indeed, 'tis frequently by means of such recollections that the obscure occurrences of history and the lesser anecdotes of the great are transmitted to posterity. There are lots of unnecessary capital letters on proper nouns, it's good. Though many of my readers have at times observed and remarked a sort of antique flow in my style of writing, it hath pleased me to pass amongst the members of this generation as a young man, giving out the fiction that I was born in 1890 in America. As played by Hagrid. Oh, that was Hagrid? What the fuck? Oh, shit. I'm so face blind. I had no idea ever in my life. I'm going to have to process this later. Wow. I am now, however, resolved to unburthen myself of a secret which I have hitherto kept through dread of incredulity, and to impart to the public a true knowledge of my many long years, in order to gratify their taste for authentic information of an age with whose famous personages I was on familiar terms. Be it then known that I was born on the family estate in Devonshire on the 10th day of August 1690, or in the new Gregorian style of reckoning, the 20th of August, being therefore now in my 228th year. Men without beards are different people. One time John shaved his beard and came up to me on the street, and I freaked out. I don't know who he was. For half a second, but still. It was like a baby not recognizing a guy without a beard. Coming early to London, I saw as a child many of the celebrated men of King William's reign, including the lamented Mr. Dryden, who sat much at the tables of Will's coffee house. With Mr. Addison and Dr. Swift I later became very well acquainted, and was an even more familiar friend to Mr. Pope, whom I knew and respected till the day of his death. But since it is of my more recent associate, the late Dr. Johnson, that I am at this time desired to write, I will pass over my youth for the present. I had first knowledge of the doctor in May of the year 1738, though I did not at that time meet him. Mr. Pope had just completed his epilogue to his satires, the piece beginning, "Not twice a 12-month you appear in print," and had arranged for its publication. On the very day it appeared, there was also published a satire in imitation of Juvenal, don't know how we pronounce it in English, entitled London by the then unknown Johnson. Unknown Johnson, good screen name. And this so struck the town that many gentlemen of taste declared that it was the work of a greater poet than Mr. Pope. Notwithstanding what some detractors have said of Mr. Pope's petty jealousy, he gave the verses of his new rival no small praise, and having learnt through Mr. Richardson who the poet was, told me that Mr. Johnson would soon be deterré. I have no idea what that means. Does it mean deterred? Or does it mean unearthed? Unearthed. Become famous? Maybe? Don't know. I had no personal acquaintance with the doctor till 1763, when I was presented to him at the Mitre Tavern by Mr. James Boswell, a young Scotchman of excellent family and great learning, but small wit, whose metrical effusions I had sometimes revised. Dr. Johnson, as I beheld him, was a full, pursy man, very ill-dressed and of slovenly aspect. I recall him to have worn a bushy bob wig, untied and without powder, and much too small for his head. His clothes were of rusty brown, much wrinkled, and with more than one button missing. His face, too full to be handsome, was likewise marred by the effects of some scrofulous disorder, and his head was continually rolling about in a sort of convulsive way. Of this infirmity, indeed, I had known before, having heard of it from Mr. Pope, who took the trouble to make particular inquiries. Sounds like Tourette's to me. Being nearly 73, full 19 years older than Dr. Johnson, I say doctor, though his degree came not till 2 years afterward, I naturally expected him to have some regard for my age, and was therefore not in that fear of him which others confessed. On my asking him what he thought of my favourable notice of his dictionary in the Londoner, my periodical paper, he said, "Sir, I possess no recollection of having perused your paper, and have not a great interest in the opinions of the less thoughtful part of mankind." Wow. Being more than a little piqued at the incivility of one whose celebrity made me solicitous of his approbation, I ventured to retaliate in kind, and told him I was surprised that a man of sense should judge the thoughtfulness of one whose productions he admitted never having read. Good try. "Why, sir," replied Johnson, "I do not require to become familiar with a man's writings in order to estimate the superficiality of his attainments, when he plainly shows it by his eagerness to mention his own productions in the first question he puts to me." Having thus become friends, we conversed on many matters. I love how Lovecraft writes a story about himself getting owned. Like, he knows that's what he's doing as well. When, to agree with him, I said I was distrustful of the authenticity of Ossian's poems, Mr. Johnson said, "That, sir, does not do your understanding particular credit, for what all the town is sensible of is no great discovery for a Grub Street critic to make. You might as well say you have a strong suspicion that Milton wrote Paradise Lost." Savage! Savage burn! Hello? Whoever is the police at this moment in time? Like to report a murder? I thereafter saw Johnson very frequently, most often at meetings of the Literary Club, which was founded the next year by the doctor, together with Mr. Burke, the parliamentary orator, Mr. Beauclerk, a gentleman of fashion, Mr. Langton, a pious man and captain of militia, Sir J. Reynolds, the widely known painter, Dr. Goldsmith, the prose and poetic writer, Dr. Nugent, father-in-law to Mr. Burke, Sir John Hawkins, Mr. Anthony Chamier, and myself. We assembled generally at 7 o'clock of an evening, once a week, at the Turk's Head in Gerrard Street, Soho, till that tavern was sold and made into a private dwelling, after which event We moved our gatherings successively to Prince's in Sackville Street, Letelier's in Dover Street, and Parslow's and the Thatched House in St. James Street. In these meetings, we preserved a remarkable degree of amity and tranquillity, which contrasts very favourably with some of the dissensions and disruptions I observe in the literary and amateur press associations of today. This tranquillity was the more remarkable because we had amongst us gentlemen of very opposed opinions. Dr. Johnson and I, as well as many others, were high Tories, whilst Mr. Burke was a Whig and against the American war, many of his speeches on that subject having been widely published. The Whigs and Tories correspond roughly to the left, the Whigs, and the right, the Tories. Roughly. The least congenial member was one of the founders, Sir John Hawkins, who hath since written many misrepresentations of our society. Sir John, an eccentric fellow, once declined to pay his part